Hello. I'd like to read you the first chapter of my book entitled Georgia Hitchhiking Incident. I have written 3 novels this year, and they are love stories. In a way, I guess you could say they're chick books. But I enjoy writing, and of course they're self-published, and they're available on Amazon. That's mainly the way most people are publishing their books these days. So anyway, I use my YouTube account and my Facebook account to promote my books. And on this one, Georgia Hitchhiking Incident, I'd like to read you the first chapter to see if you might think about ordering one of my books from Amazon. It's called Georgia Hitchhiking Incident. In January 1954, Robert decided to hitchhike from Waycross, Georgia to Sneedville, Tennessee. He wanted to see a part of the country he had never seen before. His destination was Denver, Colorado, but he was going to Sneedville, Tennessee, where a former military friend would join him on the Denver hitchhiking leg of the journey. They had planned this trip while stationed together in Germany. When Robert stepped out on the road in Waycross, Georgia, near noon, the sky was clear and the temperature was comfortable. And without planning, he was wearing a naugahyde jacket. Naugahyde was a knit fabric with a polyvinyl chloride plastic coating that looked like real leather, and anyone who thought it would provide warmth was in for a shock. So Robert was on his way to discovering that shock. In the 1950s, before the interstates, it was not unusual to see people hitchhiking a ride, so Robert was not an unfamiliar person standing out on a Georgia highway with his thumb pointing north. In the 1950s, most of the hitchhikers were in the military, going on leave, traveling the cheapest way to get home. And I don't know if I mentioned before I started reading this is science fiction. His first ride was with a delivery truck that was going up the road about 20 miles to deliver some farm equipment. The driver was a talker about non-essential stuff, so Robert sat and listened to his nonsense for 20 miles. When the delivery truck came to a dirt road, the driver told Robert the dirt road went to a farmhouse about 20 miles off the main highway. Robert knew he was going to be in a secluded part of the highway because he could not see anything but the dust from the delivery truck as it turned left off the highway and was kicking up a cloud of dust on the dry Georgia day. When Robert exited the delivery truck, he could feel the temperature had dropped a few degrees from where the truck picked him up. The new hitchhiking location was a remote part of the highway. and the tall pine trees were shading the warmth of the sun. The remoteness of this part of the highway caused Robert some concern, and he began to worry about hitching on this lonely section of backcountry Georgia roads. He knew this part of the highway would make it hard to hitch a ride. And I might add here, all the books that I write are love stories, and that's what this science fiction is all about. Hitchhiking was in those days a short wait on the highway before someone would stop and pick you up. Several roads in the 1950s were easier to catch a ride than others. If the communities located along some highways had bad reputations, then most people who were in the know steered clear of those highways, especially picking up hitchhikers. Sometimes the remoteness of the road was a difficult place to hitchhike. Most of the time, the people who did a lot of hitchhiking considered all this before setting out on a trip. Robert was not a frequent hitchhiker, so he was becoming keenly aware he was in one of those locations, and the sun was setting, or rather the sun was starting to set, and the temperature continued to fall. He was learning that the simple act of hitchhiking required some degree of planning. It would be dark soon, and Robert was delighted when an old pickup truck stopped on the highway in front of Robert. Usually when someone was giving a hitchhiker a ride, they would travel past them and pull over to the curb a few yards up the road. Doing this required the hitchhiker to run to the vehicle before the driver decided to change his mind and move on. Drivers would usually do this to give them a chance to scope out the person by looking at them through the rearview mirror as they ran to the vehicle. This was a way to see what they were carrying too. It also gave a degree of safety from other vehicles. Doing this would usually give a good view of the person as they ran to get a ride, especially on a lonely stretch of Georgia highway. Sometimes people would pull over, making the hitchhiker think he was getting a ride. When the hitchhiker was a few feet from the vehicle, they would pull out, leaving the hitchhiker standing on the road, saying curse words as the prankster drove off. This time, because of the lack of traffic on this road, the farm truck stopped on the road in front of Robert. The smell of manure scattered in the bed of the truck was a sure indication this truck was part of a farm located in this part of Georgia. Robert was wondering if the delivery truck that gave him his first ride was delivering to a farm near where the person who was now stopped in front of Robert lived. Robert could see as the driver rolled the passenger window down, he was an older man with a scraggly beard. The old man, before he opened the passenger door, began to give Robert the third degree. The third degree was a Southern colloquial term that was something like, "Who's your daddy?" After Robert satisfied the farmer he was not a fugitive from a Georgia chain gang, you got to remember this was in the 50s, from a Georgia chain gang, the farmer unlocked the passenger door and allowed Robert to open it and get into the truck. As Robert was getting into the truck, the farmer was tossing stuff into the back of the seat While he was tossing this stuff, let me read that again. As Robert was getting into the truck, the farmer was tossing stuff into the back of the seat. While he was tossing the stuff to the back of the seat, the farmer was mumbling to himself, "How did I accumulate so much junk?" The inside of the truck smelled as bad as the outside bed of the truck. As Robert and the farmer traveled up the road, the farmer was full of war stories. Robert had a suspicion the farmer would pick up hitchhikers because he had a captive audience to tell his stories. Surprisingly, Robert found some of the stories interesting and entertaining. Robert was wishing this farmer could take him to Sneedville because some of his stories were amusing and entertaining. His stories were making the time go by faster than it would have been listening to someone talking like the guy in the delivery truck who gave Robert his first hitchhiking ride. During the 1950s, business establishments known as roadhouses, located along the highway, had slot machines. Most of them were quarter machines and were illegal. The owners of these establishments always had the authorities paid off, so they were operated out in the open. Playing slot machines were usually not the only illegal activities conducted in these places. Robert had heard many wild stories about the roadhouses in Georgia. The farmer mentioned these establishments and went on a rant about how they were bad places and needed to be closed down. As the farmer continued to talk down about these roadside establishments, Robert was thinking the farmer was probably talking more or less out of the corner of his mouth. The farmer was probably an owner of one of those places and was a master at deflecting away from his association with them. Robert thought it was either that or the farmer was a partaker of what these establishments had to offer. Robert had checked the road map of this area before departing Waycross. He was sure he had this part of Georgia scoped out, but he had never been on this road before. Robert was familiar with some of the highways near Waycross, Georgia. As Robert thought about his location on the highway and the sun was setting, he was discovering hitchhiking gave you a different perspective on what you thought you knew about the Georgia highways. Hitchhiking was what Robert wanted to do to discover America from a different perspective. He was thinking he had no complaints about wanting to hitchhike because he decided he wanted to see the country from a hitchhiker's point of view, which was the best way to get the flavor of the countryside. Robert was discovering hitchhiking was more difficult than he thought. This part of Georgia was famous for its peach orchards, peanut fields, and pecans. Most of the farms in the area were profitable, and although the farmer and truck looked bad, Robert was sure the farmer and truck looked bad. I'm getting all mixed up. Let me try it again. Most of the farms in the area were profitable, and although the farmer and truck looked bad, Robert was sure the farmer who gave him a ride was loaded with money from a productive farm or, as Robert was thinking, proceeds from illegal gambling and slot machines. That's the way it was in the 50s. Robert could not remember how late it was when the farmer came to the crossroads and told Robert he was turning down Blue Springs Hollow Road. When Robert exited the farm truck, he forgot to ask the farmer the road he should take going north to the Tennessee border. Robert continued to wish the farmer was going in his direction, but he knew that sometimes good rides did not last long. Robert was enjoying the farmer's funny stories, while at the same time thinking this farmer could not be what he looked like or was acting like. Robert was thinking he would never see the farmer again, who introduced himself as James. At the time, Robert did not have a clue how wrong this thought would prove to be. Robert said goodbye to Farmer James as he exited the farm truck. He thanked James and told him he enjoyed the stories. Robert walked to the side of the road and watched the farm truck disappear as James the farmer turned left on the Blue Springs Hollow Road. And the reason Robert had to ask the directions, you'll find out if you read this in chapter 2. Back in the 50s, road signs were full of bullet holes, and most of them were laying in a ditch because people who were out partying, if they pulled up to a stop sign, they would usually shoot at the road signs or throw rocks at them. And that was the problem Robert had. There was no sign still standing, and they were all in the ditch. But that's in chapter 2. The title of this book is Georgia Hitchhiking Incident. And now this is a love story. It's a science fiction story. And I tried to write this story as if it was true. I tried to, of course, you know you can't, there's no time machines, but who knows, someday there may be. And I tried to write the story as if a time machine had really been invented. And this story gets involved, but not so involved you can't follow along. And Robert is going to meet the love of his life in this story. Well, thank you. It's called Georgia Hitchhiking Incident. Talk to you later. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.